What was about to unfold had not been planned, rehearsed, or carefully managed by producers. In fact, the next few seconds would leave the entire studio wrapped in an uncomfortable silence, so thick and tense that it felt almost physical. This was one of those rare moments in live television when the energy shifts instantly, when everyone in the room realizes they are witnessing something unscripted and unpredictable. It raises an unsettling question. What truly happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved and charming stars comes face to face with one of television's sharpest and most fearless voices, and absolutely nothing goes according to plan? From the audience seats to living rooms across the country, viewers could feel it. The air changed. Conversations stalled. Smiles froze. Even before the cameras officially rolled, there was a subtle sense that something was brewing beneath the polished surface of the show. A clash was inevitable. And on this particular morning on The View, Leonardo DiCaprio was about to face something far greater than promoting a new film or charming a talk show audience. He was about to walk straight into an unexpected storm of criticism that no one, including himself, had fully anticipated. As the studio lights blazed overhead, bright enough to feel almost blinding, the familiar rhythm of the morning show filled the room. The audience clapped on cue as Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, Sunny Hostin, and the rest of the panel smiled toward the cameras. Their expressions were warm, professional, and almost rehearsed from years of experience. Everything looked exactly as it always did, comfortable, controlled, and safe. Then Leonardo DiCaprio walked onto the set, and everything subtly shifted. He carried that unmistakable Hollywood presence with him. The effortless confidence, the relaxed posture, the faint smirk that had defined his public image for decades. To the casual observer, he looked calm and composed. But to those paying closer attention, there was something else there. A slight tension in his shoulders, a guarded energy behind his smile. It was the kind of detail glossy cameras rarely captured, but it did not escape Joy Behar. From her seat at the table, Joy noticed it immediately. Her eyes narrowed not with hostility, but with curiosity. It was the look of someone who had spent years cutting through polished personas and carefully curated images. She leaned slightly forward, studying him, already sensing that this would not be a routine celebrity interview. Well, Leonardo DiCaprio, Joy began, her voice carrying that familiar blend of humor and sharpness. We're so glad you could make it. I hear you've been quite busy saving the planet. She paused just long enough for the audience to react before adding, or is it just your latest project you're here to promote? A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, polite, but knowingly cautious. Leonardo smiled in response, his expression smooth and practiced. Thanks for having me, Joy, he replied evenly. I'm always happy to talk about both. Outwardly, he appeared relaxed. Internally, his mind was already racing. He had done countless interviews over the years, navigated difficult questions, and faced critics before. Yet something about this exchange felt different. The way Joy's gaze lingered told him this wasn't going to be simple small talk. The interview began predictably enough. Questions about his career, his films, and his public advocacy flowed easily. The audience applauded at the expected moments. Cameras cut smoothly from one close-up to another. For a brief time, it seemed like the tension might dissolve. Then Joy leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her fingers tapping lightly against the surface. Her tone changed. Leo, she said, let's talk about your environmental work for a moment. You made billions from films that, let's be honest, often celebrate indulgence and excess. How do you reconcile that with your role as an environmental activist? Or is this just a polished PR image now? The room fell silent. Leonardo's smile flickered for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable but unmistakable to anyone. Watching closely, he leaned back slightly, buying himself time, signaling careful thought. I understand that question, he said slowly, but I've always tried to use my platform to make a positive impact. The work I do outside of film is real, and I believe people in entertainment have a responsibility to use their voice. Joy's eyebrows arched. Even if your lifestyle doesn't exactly reflect it, she pressed, her tone playful on the surface, sharp underneath. A soft gasp rippled through the audience. This was no longer casual conversation. This was confrontation. Wrapped in polite television manners, Sunny Hostin attempted to intervene, suggesting that much of Leonardo's work happened behind the scenes and wasn't always visible to the public. But Joy wasn't finished. Optics matter, Joy replied firmly. People see private jets, luxury yachts. It's hard not to notice the disconnect between what you preach and what you practice. Leonardo's jaw tightened. His smile returned. Thinner now, more controlled. I can't change the world overnight, he said. I believe in progress over perfection. If my actions inspire even small changes, that matters. The tension at the table was unmistakable. Whoopi leaned back with a quiet sigh, observing the exchange. The atmosphere had shifted completely. This was no longer an interview. It was a verbal chess match. Every word carried weight. Every pause felt deliberate. Joy leaned in once more. But isn't there a point where progress isn't enough? Where people start wondering if the message is just words? Leonardo paused, then replied calmly. Action matters more than image. If the work I do helps, even in a small way, then it's worth it. A beat of silence followed before Joy offered a sly smile. So we should just ignore the private jets? She asked. Nervous laughter filled the room. The tension thickened further. Leonardo's voice sharpened slightly, though he remained composed. I'm asking people to look at the bigger picture, at the impact beyond the headlines. Joy leaned, back hands clasped. If the headlines say one thing, but the work says another, she asked, which do we believe? The audience froze, breath held. In that moment, it was clear. This was not just a celebrity appearance. It was a showdown. Neither side was backing down. So you're saying you're willing to endure criticism as long as the work speaks for itself? The question hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. For a moment, the studio lights seemed brighter, the silence heavier. Leonardo leaned back, slightly in his chair, a controlled motion that suggested both composure and calculation. He drew a slow breath, as if centering himself before answering. Yes, he said firmly. The work is always bigger than the criticism. It's bigger than the fame, bigger than the optics. His voice was steady, but not passive. It carried the confidence of someone who had repeated this belief to himself many times. Perhaps in quieter moments, far from cameras and applause, a few heads in the audience nodded instinctively. But Joy wasn't finished. She leaned forward again, elbows nearing the desk, her posture tightening as the intensity in her eyes sharpened. This wasn't a casual follow-up. This was the real question. And what about accountability, Leo? She asked. People don't just want to hear that the work matters. They want to see accountability when mistakes are made. When the image doesn't match the mission. Isn't that important? A faint ripple passed through the crowd, a collective intake of breath. Leonardo's eyes hardened almost imperceptibly, though his voice remained measured. Accountability is crucial, he replied. I hold myself accountable. I admit errors. I learn from them. But when the narrative fixates on superficial optics instead of substantive change, it becomes misleading. That's what I push back against. A soft gasp moved through the audience. The cameras swept across the set, capturing everything, the tightening of Leonardo's jaw, the unwavering focus in Joy's stare, and the quiet stillness of Whoopi, who sat observing with practiced patience, as though waiting to see whether the tension would finally break open or settle into something colder. Joy's voice lowered, now less confrontational. More conversational, but it still carried a probing edge. Do you ever feel frustrated? Leo, she asked. That no matter how much you do, people fixate on the spectacle? Leonardo paused, just long enough to feel intentional. When he answered, the words were controlled, but the passion underneath was unmistakable. Of course I feel frustrated, he said. But frustration isn't the point. Impact is. Change is. Progress is. That's what drives me. Spectacle is secondary. Compared to real outcomes, it's irrelevant. The audience leaned forward, visibly captivated. This was no longer just a morning show discussion. It was a clash of ideals, a collision between Hollywood glamour and journalistic scrutiny. Every word, every pause, every glance felt weighted with meaning. Joy's smile returned, faint and almost teasing. "I see," she said. "So the mission outweighs the optics." "Yes," Leonardo replied without hesitation. "But what if the optics undo the mission?" she pressed. "What if people lose faith because appearances suggest hypocrisy?" Leonardo's gaze sharpened. "Then I rely on consistency, on transparency, on action. I can't control perception completely, but I can control the integrity of my work. That's the only real measure of impact." The murmurs in the audience swelled approval, mixing with surprise, curiosity with awe. No one had expected such. A philosophical, almost moral confrontation on a bright, cheerful talk show set. The atmosphere had shifted. What once felt light and polished now carried weight gravity. Joy leaned back slightly, letting the moment breathe. It felt like an acknowledgement. Leonardo had made his point. But her eyes suggested the battle wasn't over, only paused. The camera lingered on Leonardo's face, catching subtle details, the restrained tension, the flicker of determination, the controlled stillness that hinted the storm was far from over. When the segment drifted toward its first unofficial pause, scattered applause broke out, not celebratory, but respectful. Not for a victory, but for the seriousness of what had unfolded. Leonardo nodded politely, his calm intact, though the confrontation had etched a visible intensity across his features. Joy met his gaze with a sharp look that promised this was not the end, only an escalation. After the commercial break, the cameras rolled again, and the air felt heavier. Dense with anticipation, electric with unspoken tension. Leonardo's composure remained, but there was an edge, now a subtle firmness, suggesting he was ready to defend himself more forcefully if needed. The audience sensed it immediately. Murmurs rippled through the seats, as if warning that the conversation was about to turn from probing to incendiary. Joy leaned forward, elbows on the desk, gaze sharp and unyielding. "Leo," she said, "I have to ask, do you ever feel that your celebrity shields you from criticism in ways ordinary people wouldn't be spared? Does fame allow you to act one way and preach another?" A hush fell over the studio. Leonardo's eyes flicked briefly toward the camera, then back to Joy. His hands rested on the table, fingers tapping lightly, an unconscious rhythm matching the tension vibrating through the room. "I won't deny that being in the public eye comes with advantages," he said calmly, "but it also comes with relentless scrutiny. Every action is examined. That's part of the responsibility. I try to use the platform to amplify change, not excuses." Joy's lips curved into a knowing smile. A flicker of triumph crossed her expression. "And yet," she said, "we're back to perception. People see excess, opulence, films about indulgence. And they wonder, how does that align with the values you promote?" The question lingered, unfinished but unmistakably sharp. Leonardo didn't rush to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but resolute. "I understand that contradiction is easy to point out," he said. "But values aren't proven by aesthetic purity. They're proven by sustained action, by consistency over time. By results that exist whether or not cameras are watching." The room stayed quiet. Not because people were stunned, but because they were listening. Joy held his gaze for a moment longer, then leaned back, folding her hands as if conceding nothing, but acknowledging something. The confrontation hadn't ended. It had deepened. And, as the cameras continued to roll, one thing was clear to everyone watching: this wasn't about celebrity anymore. It was about credibility, and neither side was ready to yield. It was supposed to be one of the safest interviews of the season. It's the kind producers schedule without anxiety, the kind that doesn't require crisis meetings or last-minute legal calls. Holiday lights softened every corner of the studio. A warm glow filled the air, comforting, intentional. The host was Irish, known more for charm than confrontation. A man whose reputation rested on wit, warmth, the ability to make even guarded guests feel at home. There would be no raised voices, no ambush questions, No viral blow-ups. No drama. At least that was the plan. But sometimes the most dangerous interviews aren't the loud ones, or not the ones where voices clash or accusations fly. The ones where the host doesn't attack at all, where he simply waits, where silence lingers just a second longer than expected. And in that pause, quiet, unprotected people reveal more than they ever meant to. This wasn't the interview Meghan Markle expected. And by the end of the night, it wouldn't end the way anyone rehearsed. The studio looked like a postcard. Version of winter. A tall Christmas tree stood just behind the desk, dressed in deep reds and muted golds, its lights glowing softly, reflecting off polished wood and glass surfaces. Garland wrapped the edge of the host's desk, carefully arranged to feel festive without overpowering the frame. Snow-like sparkles drifted slowly across the backdrop screen, creating the illusion of a calm winter evening somewhere outside Dublin, quiet and untouched. Everything about the set whispered comfort. Patrick Kielty sat comfortably behind the desk. Posture relaxed, shoulders loose. One hand rested lightly on a stack of cue cards. He barely glanced at anymore. He didn't need them. He had done this too. Long, his smile was familiar, practiced, but genuine, the kind that disarmed guests before they even realized it had happened. It was a smile built on patience, not performance. Across from him, Meghan Markle sat upright in a gray armchair, legs crossed neatly, hands folded with intention rather than ease. Posture was flawless, rehearsed without appearing stiff. Expression was composed, alert, tense not yet, but watchful. She smiled back when Patrick greeted her, but her eyes never settled. They moved constantly, scanning the room, reading the temperature, measuring the moment. "Meghan, welcome." "Back to Ireland," Patrick said warmly. Then, with a playful pause, he added, "Or at least, welcome back to Irish television." Polite ripple of laughter moved through the audience. "Thank you," Meghan replied smoothly. "It's lovely to be here." Patrick leaned slightly forward, conversational, as if they were old acquaintances catching up over coffee rather than millions watching from home. "Now, I imagine everyone expects us to dive straight into headlines," he said. "But before we do, how are you?" Truly, it was an unexpected opening. Not sharp, not provocative, just human. Meghan paused. It's just a fraction of a second too long. "I'm good," she said finally. "Busy, grateful, focused on what matters." Patrick nodded, as if accepting the answer completely. Like a full-time job in itself. Another gentle laugh from the audience. Meghan smiled wider this time, more confidently. The tension eased. Or at least it appeared to. They began on safe ground. Ireland. Charity work. Creative projects, Meghan. Spoke passionately about. Patrick asked questions that allowed her to expand, to frame her narrative comfortably, exactly as she liked. She talked about purpose, about choosing peace, about moving forward rather than looking back. As she spoke, her shoulders loosened. Her voice warmed. This was familiar territory, controlled territory. Patrick listened closely. He didn't interrupt, didn't challenge. He responded with raised eyebrows at the right moments, soft nods when she spoke about stress, about media pressure, about personal growth. To the audience, it looked like empathy. But Patrick wasn't merely listening. He was timing at one point. He glanced briefly at his cue cards, and almost casually he slid them aside, stacking them neatly out of reach. The gesture was subtle, but intentional. "Can I ask something slightly off script?" he said lightly. Meghan laughed. "Of course." Patrick tilted his head, studying her not confrontationally, not skeptically, but thoughtfully. "You often talk about reclaiming your story," he said, "about taking control of the narrative. Do you ever worry that in doing so, you leave less room for other people's versions of the same story?" The studio didn't change. The lights stayed warm. The tree kept glowing. But something invisible shifted. Meghan's smile held, but her fingers tightened briefly in her lap. "I think," she said carefully, "that everyone deserves the right to speak their truth." Patrick nodded. He waited. "And sometimes," she continued, "my truth was ignored for a very long time." Another pause. "Is one longer?" And do you think, Patrick asked softly, that truth becomes more powerful when it's shared or when it's protected? The question wasn't an attack. It wasn't even framed as a challenge. It was an invitation. And that's what made it dangerous. Meghan inhaled slowly. Her eyes flicked toward the audience, then back to Patrick. I think, she said, choosing each word that silence can be harmful. Patrick smiled gently. It can be, he agreed. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, but it can also be revealing. The audience leaned forward, sensing something without fully understanding. Yet, Patrick didn't press. He didn't follow up immediately, simply let the moment breathe. And in that space warm, that's fair, Patrick said evenly, his voice calm but deliberate. Though some might say it depends who gets to decide when the door closes. Meghan's jaw tightened slightly. It was brief blink into my sit, but unmistakable. When she answered, her voice remained smooth, practiced. But the warmth that had once softened it was gone. Anyone has the right to decide who has access to their life, she said. Patrick leaned back, eyes thoughtful rather than challenging. Even public figures? Yes, Meghan replied quickly, especially public figures. Patrick raised a finger not to interrupt, but to clarify his intent. I ask because your story has been told in many forms, he said gently. Books, interviews, documentaries. Some viewers feel they know everything, yet they're told they're not allowed to question it. Meghan's smile returned, sharp and polished, like armor sliding back into place. People feel entitled. 2 women's stories, she said. That's not new. The room reacted immediately. A few claps, a few nods. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Patrick didn't challenge the point. He didn't counter it. Instead, he let it breathe, allowing the reaction to crest and settle before speaking again. True, he said softly.
Oh.
I wonder if entitlement feels different when the audience paid to listen. That landed harder. The silence that followed was heavier now, no longer conversational. Meghan paused longer this time, her eyes lowering briefly before lifting again. You're framing this as if speaking is a transaction, she said carefully. It's not. Patrick inclined his head, acknowledging the distinction. I'm framing it as a relationship, he replied, and relationships go both ways. The silence stretched again, not empty, not hostile, just full. Meghan's hands clasped together in her lap, but this time tightly, knuckles whitening just enough to register on camera. I've never forced anyone to listen, she said. People choose to. Patrick smiled gently. They do, he agreed. And sometimes they choose to ask follow-up questions. Meghan exhaled through her nose-controlled, but audible. Patrick glanced briefly toward the audience, then back to her. You see, he said, in Ireland, when someone tells a story again and again, we eventually ask why it still needs telling. A nervous laugh rippled across the room. Not everyone laughed. Some shifted in their seats. Meghan's eyes stayed locked on him. Because the truth doesn't expire, she replied. Patrick nodded. No, he said quietly. But narratives. Can. The word hung in the air. Narrative. Meghan leaned forward slightly now, abandoning the relaxed posture she'd maintained earlier. Her tone sharpened, not louder, but firmer. I think what you're suggesting is unfair, she said, and frankly, reductive.
Patrick raised his hands slightly, palms open. Sighs. I'm not suggesting, he said. I'm asking. There.
It was again the refusal to assert. The insistence on inquiry. You've spoken often about reclaiming your voice, Patrick continued, about speaking after silence. And I respect that, truly. But do you ever worry that repetition changes? How a story is received not because it's untrue, but because it becomes fixed. Meghan's expression hardened, though her smile remained. Trauma doesn't become less valid because it's discussed, she said. No, Patrick agreed immediately. But sometimes the audience begins to feel like they're being asked to accept conclusions rather than explore complexity. The audience murmured again. It's quieter now, thoughtful. Meghan's eyes flicked briefly toward the crowd, then back to Patrick. Complexity is often code for doubt, she said, and doubt has historically been weaponized against women. Patrick nodded slowly. That's absolutely true, he said, but trust is also fragile. And when people feel they're only allowed to listen, not engage, that trust can erode.
Meghan's lips
Pressed together for a moment before she spoke again. I don't owe engagement to anyone who questions my lived experience. Patrick didn't disagree. He simply responded, no, but public conversation invites response whether we like it or not. The studio felt smaller now. Christmas lights still glowed. The garlands still framed the desk. But the warmth had shifted from comforting to close, almost pressing. Meghan straightened further, shoulders squared. What I hear, she said, is an expectation that I perform vulnerability on someone else's terms? Patrick tilted his head slightly. And what I hear, he replied, is someone who wants control over the terms entirely. The audience inhaled collectively. That's not unreasonable, Meghan said quickly. No, Patrick said, but it is revealing. Another pause. Patrick didn't look at his cards. He didn't look at the cameras. He stayed with her. When a story becomes a shield, he continued softly, it protects, but it also deflects. And sometimes people can't tell which one they're seeing anymore. Meghan shook her head slightly. That assumes bad faith on my part. It assumes fatigue on theirs, Patrick replied. The silence that followed was the longest yet. Meghan's breathing slowed deliberately. When she spoke again, her voice was measured, precise. I won't apologize for speaking my truth, Patrick smiled, almost sadly. I wouldn't ask you to. Another beat. I only wonder, he added, whether truth sometimes needs space to be heard or rest. The audience didn't laugh this time. No clapping, just stillness. Meghan leaned back slightly, her expression composed once more, but something had shifted behind her eyes. Silence has never protected me, she said. Patrick nodded. That noise, he replied gently, has never healed everyone. Who hears it? The camera cut wide again, two figures facing each other. Smiles present, tension unmistakable. Holiday decor framing a conversation that had moved far beyond celebration. No voices were raised. No lines were crossed, but the air between them felt charged now, live with things unsaid. This was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning not of facts, but of philosophies. And as the lights glowed and the audience held its breath, everyone understood. There was no easy way back to comfort now.